In this film, we're going to take a look at how the leaders of Britain's three main political parties have voted in Parliament across a range of policy issues. Our charts will be broken down into for, against, and absent. The figure in the middle of each chart represents the number of times each politician has had the chance to vote on that particular subject. Our three leaders are Boris Johnson, Conservative, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour, and Jo Swinson, Liberal Democrat. The first policy area we're going to look at is about reducing spending on welfare benefits. Boris Johnson seems to be committed to cuts in welfare benefits, as every time he has voted, he has been in favour. In contrast, Jeremy Corbyn is strongly against reducing spending on welfare benefits, as 89% of the time he has voted against cuts and has never voted for them. Jo Swinson's record shows that she also seems to be in favour of reducing spending on welfare benefits. Her record shows that she has consistently voted for it at 84%. The second policy area is about laws that promote equality and human rights. Boris Johnson has voted consistently against laws that promote equality and human rights. However, he has also been absent 57% of the time in this policy area. Jeremy Corbyn seems to be a strong advocate for laws that promote equality and human rights, having voted for them 82% of the time. Jo Swinson also seems to be largely in favour, having voted 62% of the time for laws that promote equality and human rights. The third policy area is about using UK military forces in combat operations overseas. Boris Johnson has voted for the use of military forces in combat overseas 67% of the time. At 80%, Jeremy Corbyn has almost always voted against the use of military forces, but has voted for it 10% of the time. Jo Swinson's record is similar to Boris Johnson's. She has voted for combat operations 60% of the time, against 20% of the time, and been absent 20% of the time. The fourth policy area is about measures to promote equal gay rights. Boris Johnson was absent 68% of the time, but when he did vote, he has voted both for and against promoting equal gay rights. Jeremy Corbyn's voting record very strongly supports equal gay rights, having never voted against them. Likewise, Jo Swinson seems to be a strong advocate for equal gay rights, having voted for them 75% of the time and being absent 25% of the time. The fifth policy area is about paying higher benefits over longer periods of time for those unable to work due to illness or disability. Every time Boris Johnson has voted in this area, he has been against paying higher benefits to those unable to work and has been absent 12.5% of the time. Jeremy Corbyn has had the chance to vote in this area 15 times, and he has voted 100% of the time in favour of increasing benefits over longer periods of time to those unable to work due to illness or disability. He has not missed a chance to vote in this area. In contrast, Jo Swinson has voted 100% against raising benefits over longer periods of time and has also never been absent on a vote in this area. The sixth policy area is about the right to remain in the UK for EU citizens after Brexit. Boris Johnson has voted for 11% of the time and against 78% of the time. Jeremy Corbyn has voted in favour of the right to remain 44% of the time and both against and absent 28% of the time. Jo Swinson has given the strongest support for the right to remain for EU citizens by voting for 60% of the time. The seventh policy area is on raising the taxes on banks. Boris Johnson has voted in this area 8 times and has consistently voted against raising the taxes on banks. Jeremy Corbyn is almost evenly split on this issue, but is slightly more in favour, for receiving 47% of his vote share. Jo Swinson has voted for raising taxes on the banks 67% of the time, making her the strongest advocate in this policy area. The eighth policy area is about reducing the rate of corporation tax. Boris Johnson is the strongest advocate for reducing the rate of corporation tax, having voted consistently for it. He has only been absent 11% of the time. In contrast, Jeremy Corbyn has voted against 81% of the time, suggesting he is strongly averse to reducing the rate of corporation tax. Jo Swinson is also a strong advocate for reducing the rate of corporation tax, having voted for it 88% of the time. The ninth policy area is about reforming the NHS so that GPs buy services for patients. To be clear, the term buying services means purchasing services from the private sector for patient treatment and care. Boris Johnson has only had one chance to vote in this area, and he voted for buying services for patients. Jeremy Corbyn has voted 8 times in this area, and he has voted 100% consistently against the reforms. Jo Swinson has voted for buying services 50% of the time, and she was absent 50% of the time. The 10th policy area is about greater autonomy for schools. Boris Johnson has voted in this area 12 times and has voted for greater autonomy 92% of the time. Jeremy Corbyn's record is almost the complete opposite. He has voted against greater autonomy for schools consistently at 94%. Jo Swinson has voted both for and against, but is generally in favour, having voted for greater autonomy 50% of the time. The 11th policy area is about reducing the funding for local government. Boris Johnson has voted 4 times in this area, and he has consistently voted to reduce funding for local government. Jeremy Corbyn has voted 8 times in this area, and he has consistently voted 100% of the time against cuts for local government. Jo Swinson has voted 6 times in this area, and she has voted for reducing funding for local government 50% of the time and been absent 50% of the time. The 12th policy area is about removing hereditary peers in the House of Lords. Boris Johnson missed the opportunity to vote on this subject 2/3 of the time, but when he has voted, he has consistently voted against removing hereditary peers. Jeremy Corbyn was absent 36% of the time, but when he did vote, he voted consistently to remove hereditary peers. Jo Swinson also seems strongly in favour of removing hereditary peers, as she voted consistently for it at 80%. The 13th policy area is about measures to prevent climate change. Boris Johnson voted against measures to prevent climate change 50% of the time and was absent 43% of the time. Jeremy Corbyn is strongly in favour of measures to prevent climate change, voting 69% of the time for it. Similarly, Jo Swinson has been for measures to prevent climate change 53% of the time. The 14th policy area is about the mass retention of communications information. Boris Johnson has only voted twice in this area, but he has been consistently for retaining communications information. Jeremy Corbyn has voted against retaining information 20% of the time, but he has missed 80% of the votes in this area. Jo Swinson has largely been in favour of mass retention of communications information, having voted for it 67% of the time. The 15th policy area is about giving more powers to local councils. Boris Johnson has voted against giving more powers to local councils 27% of the time, and he was absent 66% of the time. Jeremy Corbyn voted both for and against. 50% of the time he voted for giving more powers to local councils, and 29% of the time he voted against. Jo Swinson seems split on the issue, voting 35% for, 40% against, and being absent 25%. The 16th and final policy area we're going to look at is about transferring more powers to the Scottish Parliament. Boris Johnson seems to be the biggest advocate for not transferring more powers to Scotland, having voted consistently against it at 72%. Jeremy Corbyn voted for transferring more powers 30% of the time, but missed the opportunity to vote in this area 61% of the time. Finally, Jo Swinson seems mainly to oppose transferring more powers to Scotland, having voted against it 48% of the time and only for it 19% of the time. I hope this film will help viewers see past the party political rhetoric and make an informed decision on June the 8th, with a greater understanding of each party leader's history and priorities. All statistics used in this film came from the website They Work For You and can be verified at theyworkforyou.com.